Hey guys, tonight we travel back to a world lit by oil lamps and ruled by a fading memory. Picture this. It's the middle of the 6th century. In the east, in the magnificent city of Constantinople, an emperor dreams. But he doesn't dream of the future. He dreams of the past. In the west, the city of Rome, once the heart of the known world, is a shadow of its former self. Its forums are quiet, its grand palaces are crumbling, and its people are ruled by a Germanic king who wears the fashion of a Roman but worships a different Christ. The scale of what we're about to explore is immense. It's the story of an attempt to rewind history, to mend a fracture that had split the world in two. It's a story about the intoxicating and often ruinous power of an idea. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the light, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you're standing in the great palace of Constantinople in the year 532. The city is on fire. Not literally, not yet, but the air is thick with the smoke of rebellion. The Nika riots, a spasm of urban rage that began at the chariot races, have spiralled out of control. The city's factions, the blues and the greens, have united against their emperor. They've burned the original Hagia Sophia to the ground, and they are chanting for a new ruler. Inside the palace, the man they want to depose, a 50-year-old emperor named Justinian, is planning to flee. His advisors are packing the treasury onto ships. It's over. The dream is dead before it can even begin. But then, a voice cuts through the panic. It's his wife, the Empress Theodora, a former actress and courtesan with a spine of pure steel. She looks at the men planning their escape, and according to the historian Procopius, she tells them that the sea is a fine escape route, but she is not going. Royalty, she says, is a fine burial shroud. That single moment of defiance changes everything. Justinian, shamed and inspired, stays. He unleashes his trusted general, a quiet Thracian named Belisarius, who herds the rioters into the hippodrome and massacres them. It's a brutal, bloody end to the uprising, but it cements Justinian's power. He's no longer a shaky newcomer. He is an absolute autocrat, answerable only to God. And it is from this crucible of fire and blood that his grand ambition is forged, the Renovatio Imperii Romanorum, the restoration of the Roman Empire. You have to understand, for Justinian, this wasn't just a political project or a land grab. It was a sacred duty. From his golden throne in Constantinople, the city they still called New Rome, he looked west and saw a world out of balance. For nearly 60 years, since the last Western emperor was deposed in 476, Italy had been ruled by Ostrogoths, North Africa by Vandals, and Spain by Visigoths. These were Germanic tribes who, while often admiring Roman culture, were seen by the Orthodox court in Constantinople as two things: barbarians and heretics. Most of them followed Arian Christianity, a branch of the faith that the Council of Nicaea had condemned 2 centuries earlier. For Justinian, a man who spent his nights debating theological minutiae, this was an intolerable stain on the Roman legacy. The empire had to be made whole again, not just in territory, but in faith. One empire, one law, one God. His contemporaries, even his own officials, thought he was mad. The Eastern Empire was already vast and difficult to manage. It had a long, hostile border with the powerful Sasanian Persian Empire, and the Danube frontier was under constant pressure from Slavic and Bulgar tribes. To launch a massive amphibious invasion across the Mediterranean seemed, to put it mildly, a bit of a stretch. But Justinian had Theodora's will, Belisarius' genius, and the conviction of a man who believes he is God's chosen instrument. The test case came in 533. Justinian set his sights on the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. It was a gamble. The last time the Eastern Romans had sent a fleet to attack the Vandals, decades earlier, it had ended in one of the worst naval disasters in history. But Justinian's luck held. Belisarius, with a relatively small force of around 15,000 men, landed, defeated the Vandal army twice in quick succession, and captured their capital of Carthage. The entire campaign was over in a matter of months. It was a stunning success, and it sent a shockwave across the Mediterranean. The invincible barbarian kingdoms suddenly looked very fragile. Here's a little tidbit that shows you just how profound this victory felt to the people of the time. When Belisarius returned to Constantinople, Justinian granted him a triumph, an ancient Roman honour that hadn't been seen in the city for centuries. And as Belisarius paraded the spoils of his conquest through the streets, the crowd saw something incredible. Among the captured Vandal treasures were the sacred objects from the Second Temple in Jerusalem, including the Great Menorah. These were the very artifacts the Emperor Titus had seized after sacking Jerusalem in 70 AD, which the Vandals had then looted from Rome in 455. Now they were back in Roman hands. It was as if Justinian had reached back across 5 centuries and reconnected the threads of history. This victory, of course, only fueled the fire. Now his eyes turned to the ultimate prize, Italy, and with it, the city of Rome itself. The political situation there gave him the perfect excuse. The Ostrogothic king had been murdered, and his pro-Byzantine sister regent, Amalasuntha, was also killed shortly after. Justinian could now frame his invasion not as a naked conquest, but as a righteous act of vengeance for a fallen ally. Still, historians still argue passionately over Justinian's true motivations. Was he the last of the truly Roman emperors, driven by a pious and heartfelt desire to restore the empire of Augustus and Constantine? Or was he a ruthless pragmatist, a gambler who, having survived the Nika riots, needed a grand foreign adventure to secure his throne, distract his enemies, and most importantly, bring the wealthy tax revenues of Africa and Italy back under imperial control? Perhaps the truth, as it often does, lies somewhere in the middle. He was a man of sincere, almost obsessive faith, who also happened to believe that what was good for God's empire was very, very good for Justinian's treasury. In our history, this is where the dream began to curdle. The war for Italy, which Justinian thought would be as swift as the Vandal campaign, turned into a 20-year nightmare. It was a grinding, brutal conflict that shattered the Italian peninsula, drained the imperial treasury, and left the city of Rome a depopulated ruin. The empire he reconquered was a corpse. The Gothic War bled the Eastern Empire so badly that it was left critically vulnerable to the plagues, invasions, and crises that would follow. Justinian's dream, in our world, was achieved at a price so high it nearly destroyed the dreamer. But as you drift off tonight, let's imagine a different path. A world where the dice roll differently, where the dream doesn't sour, where the restoration of the West is not a catastrophe, but a triumph. Belisarius stands with his army, the African campaign a stunning success behind him. He looks across the sea to Sicily, the stepping stone to Italy. In our timeline, he is sailing toward a quagmire. In the world we're about to build, he is sailing toward destiny. So there he is, Belisarius, the hero of the Vandalic War, his gaze fixed north from Carthage. And what is he looking at, exactly? What is this Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy that Justinian coveted so dearly? To understand the war that is about to happen, and in our alternate history, the war that will go so very differently, you have to understand the strange, hybrid world the Goths had built on the ruins of the Western Empire. It wasn't the savage wasteland that Justinian's propagandists liked to paint. For the better part of a generation, it had been the most stable and prosperous place in Western Europe. This was almost entirely due to one man, Theodoric the Great. Theodoric was a fascinating figure. A Goth, yes, but one who had spent his youth as a high-status hostage in Constantinople. He knew the Roman world intimately, its power, its sophistication, its bureaucracy. When he invaded Italy in 493, at the behest of the previous Eastern Emperor Zeno, he didn't just smash the place up. He established a dual system. The Goths would be the military caste, the protectors of the realm. The Romans, the vast majority of the population, would run the civil administration, just as they always had. He kept the Senate in Rome, respected its ancient privileges, repaired the aqueducts, drained the marshes, and maintained the roads. For the average Italian farmer or Roman aristocrat, life under Theodoric was probably better and certainly more peaceful than it had been for a century. Crucially, Theodoric, an Arian Christian himself, practiced a policy of remarkable religious tolerance. This is a solid historical fact, often overlooked. At a time when religious persecution was the norm, he protected the Catholic majority, telling them, "We cannot command religion, for no man can be forced to believe against his will." He even extended this protection to Italy's Jewish communities, chastising a mob that had burned a synagogue in Rome and ordering it rebuilt at their own expense. So when you hear about Justinian's liberation of Italy, you have to remember that for many people living there, it wasn't immediately clear what they were being liberated from. But Theodoric's kingdom, for all its successes, had a fatal flaw. It was built on the charisma of one man, not on the integration of two peoples. Goths and Romans were forbidden from intermarrying. They lived side by side, but separate. When Theodoric died in 526, this carefully balanced structure began to wobble. His designated heir was his 10-year-old grandson, Athalaric, with Theodoric's highly intelligent, Roman-educated daughter, Amalasuntha, acting as regent. Amalasuntha tried to continue her father's pro-Roman policies. She hired Roman tutors for her son, wanting to raise a philosopher king in the Roman mould. The Gothic warrior nobility was horrified. They saw their culture being diluted, their king being made soft. They demanded he be educated their way, which mostly involved drinking and fighting. The poor boy, caught between two worlds, predictably went off the rails and died of alcoholism before he turned 20. This left Amalasuntha in a perilous position. To secure her rule, she made a disastrous choice. She elevated her cousin, Theodahad, to be her co-ruler. Theodahad was, to put it kindly, not kingly material. He was a wealthy, greedy landowner, more interested in reading Plato than in leading an army. Here's a quirky little detail for you. Theodahad was so un-Gothic in his temperament that before the crisis he had actually been in secret negotiations with Justinian's agents, offering to sell the entire kingdom of Italy for a handsome price and a quiet retirement in a Constantinopolitan villa. He was a schemer, not a ruler, and his first act as co-king was to betray his cousin. He had Amalasuntha, Justinian's friend and ally, imprisoned on an island in Lake Bolsena, and in 535 quietly arranged for her to be strangled in her bath. For Justinian, this was perfect. The murder of a pro-Roman queen gave him a flawless casus belli. He could now invade Italy not as a conqueror, but as an avenger, a restorer of legitimate order. Theodahad, the philosopher wannabe who had just murdered his way to the throne, was a weak and illegitimate ruler presiding over a kingdom that was deeply divided. Italy was a fruit ripe for the picking. Meanwhile, what of the Eastern Empire, the force about to do the picking? It was, without a doubt, the most powerful state in the Mediterranean world. Constantinople was a megacity, the hub of global trade routes stretching from Britain to China. Its bureaucracy was complex and ancient, a well-oiled machine for collecting taxes and administering laws. Justinian was in the process of commissioning the Corpus Juris Civilis, the Code of Justinian, a monumental effort to collate and rationalise 1,000 years of Roman law. This wasn't just a legal clean-up, it was a statement. We are the centre of law, of civilization, of Rome. In fact, scholars continue to debate whether we should even call it the Byzantine Empire at this stage. The people living there certainly didn't. They called themselves Romaioi, Romans. Justinian was the Roman emperor, full stop. The notion of a separate Byzantine identity would come much, much later. The empire's army was formidable. It wasn't the old citizen legion of the Republic, but a diverse professional force of heavy cavalry, the cataphracts, skilled archers, and elite federati, or allied barbarian troops. At the very tip of the spear were the bucellari, the private household soldiers of generals like Belisarius. These were the special forces of their day, loyal to their commander first and the state second, a fact that would cause some, let's say, trust issues down the line. But this colossus had feet of clay. The empire was dangerously overstretched. Justinian had just signed what he called the Eternal Peace with the Sasanian Persian Empire in the east. But his rival, the brilliant King Khosrow I, was just as ambitious as Justinian, and everyone knew that eternal was a suggestion, not a guarantee. Any major commitment of troops in the west would leave the wealthy provinces of Syria and Anatolia dangerously exposed. At the same time, the long Danube frontier in the Balkans was a sieve. Slavs, Bulgars and other tribes poured across in yearly raids, plundering and depopulating vast swathes of land. Justinian was building hundreds of forts along the border, but it was like trying to patch 1,000 holes in a dam. Pulling experienced troops from that frontier for a jaunt in Italy was a huge risk. So you see the stage. In the west, a kingdom that looks strong on the outside, but is rotted with division from within, led by a weak, unpopular usurper. In the east, a mighty empire, brimming with confidence after its easy victory in Africa, led by a man who believes he is on a mission from God. But that same empire is stretched thin, juggling multiple existential threats, and betting its future on a single, massive gamble. It is a moment of profound instability, where one decisive campaign, one stroke of luck, could change the map of the world forever. In our world, Justinian's gamble in Italy was a catastrophic miscalculation. He thought he was walking into another swift, Vandalic-style victory, but he walked into a meat grinder. The Gothic War dragged on for nearly 20 years, from 535 to 554. It wasn't just a war, it was a cycle of sieges, famines, and atrocities that shattered Italian society. Rome itself was captured and recaptured 5 times. By the end, the city's population had dwindled from hundreds of thousands to perhaps 30,000 souls huddled among the ruins. Aqueducts were cut, fields were burned, and the old senatorial aristocracy was practically wiped out. Then, as if God himself had decided to mock Justinian's ambition, the Plague of Justinian hit in 541. This was the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague, a horror that swept out of Egypt and killed, by some estimates, up to a third of the empire's population. This plague didn't just kill people, it killed the war effort. The Byzantine army was decimated, tax revenues plummeted, the empire already strained was hollowed out. The long, ruinous war in Italy and the demographic catastrophe of the plague ensured that even though Justinian won in the end, the prize was a wasteland, and he had permanently crippled his own empire in the process. But that's not our story tonight. Let's wind back the clock to 536. The invasion has begun. Belisarius has easily taken Sicily. The Goths, led by the useless Theodahad, are in disarray. This is our point of divergence. In this timeline, we're going to make 2 crucial changes, 2 plausible shifts in fortune that change the course of history forever. First, the Plague of Justinian never happens. Maybe the infected fleas on the grain ships from Egypt die in a freak storm. Maybe the strain of Yersinia pestis is less virulent. Whatever the reason, the empire is spared that apocalyptic blow. The manpower, the tax base, the social cohesion, it all remains intact. The engine of Justinian's war machines can run at full throttle without sputtering to a halt. Second, the Goths get a different leader, but not the one they got in our history. In reality, the Gothic army, disgusted with Theodahad's cowardice, deposed him and elected a man named Witiges. Witiges was a decent, old-school soldier, but he was no genius. He made a series of strategic blunders, getting his main army bogged down in a disastrous year-long siege of Rome, which allowed Belisarius to hold out and Byzantine reinforcements to arrive. In our alternate timeline, let's imagine the Goths make a smarter choice. Perhaps they turn to a younger, more dynamic commander. A fictional figure, let's call him Valerius. A man who understands that he cannot beat the Byzantines at their own game of sieges and set-piece battles. He knows his only hope is a war of movement, so Belisarius crosses into southern Italy. He takes Naples. He marches on Rome. And just like in our history, the city's population, weary of Gothic rule and impressed by the imperial prestige, opens the gates to him in December 536. He is hailed as a liberator. But here, the script changes. Instead of marching his huge army down to besiege Belisarius in Rome, our clever Gothic commander Valerius does the opposite. He pulls his forces back, north, to the Gothic heartland around Ravenna. He refuses to be drawn into a siege. He cedes the south of Italy to Belisarius for the moment, preserving his main field army. He will fight on his own terms. This presents Belisarius with a problem. He doesn't have the numbers to garrison every town in the south and march north to confront the main Gothic army. He asks Justinian for reinforcements, and because there has been no plague, Justinian has them to spare. He sends not just a trickle of troops, but a second full field army under the command of another general, let's say the eunuch Narses, just as he did in our history, but he sends them sooner and in greater numbers. Now, in our timeline, the arrival of Narses was a disaster, because he and Belisarius despised each other. Their rivalry and refusal to cooperate led to the loss of Milan and a series of military setbacks. This division of command is a well-documented historical fact that crippled the Byzantine effort. But Justinian, in our story, is not a fool. He has learned from the rivalries that plagued his court. Before sending Narses, he makes it absolutely terrifyingly clear. Belisarius is the supreme commander. Narses is his subordinate. Disobey, and you will answer to me. With the memory of the Nika riot still fresh, the threat carries weight. Narses, ambitious but not suicidal, agrees. So, by 538, 2 years into the war, the situation is this. Belisarius holds southern and central Italy, including Rome. The main Gothic army under Belisarius is intact and shadowing him from the north. But now, a massive, fresh Byzantine army under a cooperating Narses lands on the Adriatic coast, near the Gothic capital of Ravenna. The Goths are caught in a pincer. Belisarius, our shrewd Gothic king, is no fool. He sees the writing on the wall. He can't fight two massive imperial armies at once. He decides on a desperate, brilliant gamble. He knows Justinian's real weakness is not in Italy, but in the east. He sends secret envoys to the Sasanian king, Khosrow I, carrying a fortune in gold, begging him to break the eternal peace and attack the empire's soft underbelly in Syria. In our history, this is exactly what the Goths did, and it worked. Khosrow, seeing his chance, invaded in 540, sacked the great city of Antioch, and forced Justinian to recall Belisarius from Italy to deal with the Persian threat. This gave the Goths breathing room and prolonged the war for over a decade. But here, our no-plague scenario makes all the difference. Justinian, with a full treasury and ample manpower, had not stripped the eastern frontier bare. He had left a powerful defensive force there under one of his other capable generals, a man named Cetus. When the Persian envoys arrive, Khosrow hears their plea, but his own spies tell him that the Roman defences in Syria are still strong. The gamble looks much riskier. At the same time, a rebellion breaks out on his own northern border. Scholars have long debated Khosrow's strategic calculus, but faced with a strong Roman frontier and a fire in his own backyard, he makes a different choice. He takes the Gothic gold, thanks them very much, and marches his army north to deal with his own problems. The eternal peace holds. The Goths' last hope is gone. There will be no Persian invasion, no recall of Belisarius. Trapped between two converging imperial armies, Belisarius knows the game is up. Instead of fighting to the last man and turning Italy into a wasteland, he seeks terms. He meets with Belisarius outside Ravenna. He knows he cannot remain king, but he negotiates for the survival of his people. In exchange for a complete surrender, the Goths will be allowed to settle as federati in the depopulated lands of the Po Valley, serving in the Roman army as a buffer against potential raids from the Franks across the Alps. Belisarius, eager to avoid a bloody final siege and to complete his conquest, agrees. In the spring of 539, less than 4 years after it began, the Gothic War is over. Belisarius enters Ravenna in triumph. Italy is Roman once more. There has been no 20-year slog, no apocalyptic plague, no destruction of Rome, no emptying of the treasury. Justinian's gamble has paid off beyond his wildest dreams. The news reaches Constantinople, and the city erupts in celebration. The emperor has done the impossible. He has healed the wound of 476. The Western Empire, it seems, is reborn. But as the cheers echo through the streets of two capitals, the real challenges are only just beginning. Imagine the silence. Not the dead silence of a ruin, which is what our history gave Rome, but the quiet, humming silence of anticipation. It's the autumn of 539. The Gothic War, in our new timeline, is over. Belisarius, the conquering hero, is making his formal entry into the city of Ravenna, the former capital of the Western Empire, and now the seat of Ostrogothic power. The city isn't a smouldering wreck, it's a jewel. Its magnificent churches, decorated with shimmering mosaics that blend Roman and Gothic artistry, are intact. The tomb of Theodoric, a marvel of engineering with its roof made from a single 300-ton slab of Istrian stone, stands untouched. There was no need for a final destructive siege. The Gothic nobles, their impressive moustaches drooping in defeat, hand over the keys to the city. Their last king, our fictional Valoris, has formally submitted. Belisarius, ever the stoic professional, accepts their surrender with solemn dignity, not triumphalist arrogance. He knows his job isn't just to conquer, but to govern. He immediately issues proclamations guaranteeing the safety and property of the citizens, both Roman and Goth. The transition is swift, efficient, and most importantly, peaceful. The machinery of Roman administration, which had been running under the Goths for decades, simply gets a new boss. The Roman tax assessors, lawyers, and bureaucrats who had served Theodoric now serve Justinian. From Ravenna, Belisarius travels south to Rome, and his entry into the ancient capital is a profoundly different event than in our history. He isn't entering a besieged, starving city that has already been fought over. He is entering a city that willingly opened its gates to him 3 years prior and has been under stable imperial administration ever since. The aqueducts are still flowing. The markets are still full. The great senatorial families, the Anigi, the Simaci, haven't been slaughtered or sent into exile. They emerge from their sprawling villas on the Calian hill to greet him, clad in the white togas of their ancestors. A bit dusty perhaps, but still there. For them this is a moment of vindication. For generations they had been forced to collaborate with barbarian rulers. Now, the legitimate emperor of the Romans from Constantinople had reclaimed his rightful city. Pope Silverius, the Bishop of Rome, leads a grand procession to the Lateran Palace to welcome the imperial general. It's a crucial historical fact that the papacy had often found itself in a difficult position under the Arian Goths, constantly navigating the line between cooperation and theological opposition. For the Pope, the arrival of an Orthodox Catholic general is at first a moment of profound relief. Finally, the Church in Rome and the Church in Constantinople are on the same side again. Or so it seems. The reaction of the common people of Rome is more complex. You have to remember, for the average Roman shopkeeper or artisan, the name Justinian is a distant abstraction. What they know is that for the past 60 years, the Gothic kings had for the most part kept the peace and filled the granaries. Now, these new Greek-speaking soldiers are here. There's a sense of pride, certainly, The eagle standards are back, a sight no living Roman has ever seen. But there is also apprehension. These Easterners, these Graeculi, little Greeks, a term of mild contempt the Romans sometimes used, what will their rule be like? Will their taxes be higher? Will they respect the traditions of the city and its beloved bishop? Belisarius understands this. He is a master of political theatre. He doesn't install himself in one of the old imperial palaces on the Palatine Hill. That would be too ostentatious. Instead, he takes up residence in a more modest dwelling, living a life of disciplined austerity that impresses the locals. He makes a point of consulting with the Senate, even though everyone knows the real power lies with him, and ultimately with the emperor 1,000 miles away. He uses imperial funds, freshly topped up by the captured Gothic treasury, to begin a modest programme of public works, clearing a blocked sewer here, repairing a section of the Aurelian walls there. These aren't grand projects, but they send a powerful message. The empire is back not just to rule, but to care for the city. And here's a quirky, humanising detail. In our history, during the dreadful siege of Rome, Belisarius had to take extreme measures, including rationing grain to the point where people were making bread out of acorns. He became a figure of fear. In this timeline, he gets to be a different kind of figure. He famously had a stable of remarkable horses, his personal chargers. Imagine him now, not as a grim defender, but as a celebrated conqueror, riding one of these magnificent beasts through the forum. His elite Bucellari bodyguards in their gleaming armour at his side. He becomes a living symbol of the restored empire's power and glamour. A celebrity general, the likes of which Rome hasn't seen since the days of Scipio or Caesar. The speed and relative bloodlessness of the conquest have a profound psychological impact. In our timeline, the Gothic War was so horrific that it fostered a deep-seated resentment in Italy towards Byzantine rule. The liberators had destroyed the country. This resentment would fester for centuries, contributing to the eventual collapse of Byzantine power in the peninsula. But here, that trauma doesn't exist. Belisarius is not the destroyer of Italy. He is its swift, efficient saviour. The debate among historians would shift dramatically. Instead of asking, was Justinian's reconquest a Pyrrhic victory? They would ask, was the swift reabsorption of Italy the emperor's single greatest achievement? The narrative changes from one of imperial overreach and tragic failure to one of brilliant success. The news that Italy had fallen so quickly and painlessly sends ripples across the rest of the splintered West. The other Germanic kingdoms, who had watched the Vandalic War with alarm, are now terrified. The Byzantines had crushed the Vandals in months. They had crushed the Goths in less than 4 years. Who was next? In Visigothic Spain, rival claimants to the throne start looking over their shoulders, wondering if they should make a deal with Constantinople before it's too late. In Frankish Gaul, the ambitious Merovingian kings, who had been profiting from the chaos in Italy, suddenly see the revitalised empire not as a distant memory, but as a powerful and immediate neighbour. Back in Constantinople, Justinian receives Belisarius's dispatch reporting the final surrender of the Goths. He proceeds, as is his custom, to the Hagia Sophia, the new glorious one he had built after the Nika riots, to give thanks to God. As he stands beneath its colossal dome, the largest interior space in the world, he must feel that his destiny is manifest. He has done what no emperor had done in a century. He has brought Africa and Italy back into the fold. He is the restorer, the new Constantine. The Roman lake, the Mare Nostrum, is well on its way to being Roman once more. And with the war over so quickly and the treasury still full, his gaze, and Belisarius's, naturally begins to turn outward. The Renovatio Imperii is just getting started. The rapid, triumphant conclusion of the Gothic War changes the entire strategic equation for Justinian. In our history, the 20-year slog in Italy exhausted the empire, making any further large-scale adventures in the west impossible. Justinian did manage a small intervention in the Visigothic civil war in Spain in the 550s, seizing a slice of territory along the southern coast that became the province of Spania. But it was a sideshow, an opportunistic grab with limited resources. The empire was too tired, too poor, too plague-ridden to do more. But in this new reality, it's only 540. The imperial coffers are full, not just with regular tax revenue, but with the captured wealth of the Gothic kingdom. The army is flush with victory, its morale sky high. Belisarius, the most brilliant general of his age, is at the height of his powers. And crucially, he is not needed to put out fires in the east, as the peace with Persia is holding. The Renovatio Imperii has momentum. To stop now would seem like a failure of nerve, a betrayal of God's manifest favour. The question is not if the empire will expand further, but where. The two obvious targets are the remaining large Germanic kingdoms, Visigothic Spain and the sprawling, chaotic realm of the Franks in Gaul. Justinian and his advisors in the Great Palace would have weighed the options carefully. Gaul is tempting. It's wealthy. And it was, of course, a core province of the old Western Empire. But the Franks are a problem. They are numerous, decentralised, and notoriously ferocious fighters. Unlike the Goths and Vandals, they are also not Arian heretics. Their king, Clovis, had converted to Nicene Orthodox Catholicism a generation earlier. This removes Justinian's favourite pretext of liberating oppressed Catholics. An invasion of Gaul would be a long, bloody affair against a fellow Catholic power, making it hard to justify. Visigothic Spain, however, is a different story. It's a perfect target. Like the Goths and Vandals, the Visigothic ruling class is Arian, while the vast Hispano-Roman majority of the population is Catholic. The country is also, at this precise moment, tearing itself apart in a civil war. In our timeline, a nobleman named Athanagild rebelled against King Agila I. It was Athanagild who invited Justinian's forces into Spain as allies, hoping to use them to win his war. This is the door Justinian will walk through, but in our new history, he won't just be knocking politely, he'll be kicking the door down. Instead of sending a small expeditionary force, as he did historically, Justinian dispatches a major army. And who better to lead it than the man who has never known defeat, Belisarius? Leaving his trusted subordinate Narses to consolidate the new administration in Italy, Belisarius gathers his veteran Bucellari and a significant portion of the army of Italy. He doesn't sail from Constantinople, but from the newly secured ports of Sicily and southern Italy, dramatically shortening his supply lines. In the summer of 541, the imperial fleet appears off the coast of southern Spain, near the ancient city of Gades, modern Cadiz. The scale of the force shocks both warring Visigothic factions. This is not the small contingent of mercenaries Athanagild was expecting. This is a full-scale invasion. Belisarius lands, and the campaign unfolds like a repeat of his Vandalic triumph. The Hispano-Roman cities of the south, Corduba, Hispalis, Seville, Malacca, are overwhelmingly Catholic and still culturally Roman. It's a historical fact that Roman identity and institutions remained remarkably strong in southern Spain for centuries after the empire's political collapse. These cities see Belisarius not as a foreign invader, but as the representative of the legitimate Roman emperor, come to deliver them from the heretical Visigoths. They throw open their gates. The two rival Visigothic kings, Aguila and Athanagild, are forced to patch together a hasty truce to face the common enemy. But it's too late. Their armies are disunited and demoralised. Belisarius, using his classic tactic of combining heavy cavalry charges with disciplined archery, crushes their combined force in a single decisive battle somewhere on the plains of Andalusia. Within a year, by 542, the entire southern half of the Iberian Peninsula, the wealthy and populous region of Baetica, is under firm imperial control. Belisarius could push further north, towards the Visigothic capital at Toledo, but he is a prudent commander. He knows the central plateau of Spain, the Meseta, is harder country and more staunchly Gothic. He advises Justinian to consolidate their gains. They now hold the richest part of Spain. Let the Visigoths squabble over the poorer north. He establishes a new provincial capital at Cordoba and begins integrating this vast new territory into the restored empire. Meanwhile, what of the Franks? The Merovingian kings, watching from across the Pyrenees, are stunned. In 2 years, the Byzantines have swallowed half of Spain. The Roman Empire is no longer a nostalgic memory. It's a superpower on their southern border. Their reaction is likely to be a mix of fear and opportunism. A quirky tidbit about the Merovingians: they loved to claim a connection to Rome, minting coins with the emperor's face on them, while putting their own name on the back, of course. It was a way of borrowing imperial prestige. Now that prestige is real, and it's right next door. The Frankish king, probably Theudebert I, a particularly ambitious and clever Merovingian, sees the writing on the wall. He can either fight this resurgent empire or join it. He chooses the latter. He sends envoys not to fight Belisarius, but to treat with him. Theudebert had, in our history, actually proposed an alliance with the Goths to attack the Byzantines. Here, he sees a better deal. He offers to recognise Justinian as the supreme sovereign. In exchange for a massive gold subsidy and the title of patricius, or even consul, he will formally acknowledge the suzerainty of the emperor in Constantinople. He will effectively become the empire's high king in Gaul, its client and bulwark against the other Germanic tribes east of the Rhine. Justinian, ever the pragmatist, agrees. It's a brilliant deal for him. He gained nominal control over Gaul without fighting a costly war. He can now claim, with some justification, that the Roman Empire once again stretches from the shores of Syria to the Atlantic coast of Spain and the forests of Gaul. The Mediterranean is truly Mare Nostrum again. The Renovatio Imperii is, for all intents and purposes, complete. Of course, a fierce scholarly debate would erupt over the nature of this restored empire. Was it truly a restoration, or a new hybrid entity? The West was not the same as it was in 395. The Germanic element was now deeply embedded, from the Gothic foederati in the Po Valley to the Frankish client kingdom in Gaul. The empire that Justinian has now forged is not a simple resurrection of the past. It's something new. A predominantly Greek-speaking Eastern autocracy, now ruling over a vast, multi-ethnic, Latin-speaking West. The military and political victory is total, but the administrative, cultural and religious challenges of holding this sprawling, diverse empire together are only just beginning to surface. The two halves of the Roman world, separated for a century, are now yoked together. But are they pulling in the same direction? The year is now, let's say, 545. The wars of reconquest are over. The military parades are finished. Now comes the hard part. You've conquered North Africa, Italy, and half of Spain. You've brought the Franks to heel as client kings. You have on paper restored the Roman Empire. Now you have to run it. And this is an administrative challenge of staggering proportions, one that will define the future of this reborn entity. Justinian, back in Constantinople, can't just rely on military governors and emergency measures forever. He needs to build a coherent, unified state. His great tool for this is the law. Remember the Corpus Juris Civilis, the massive legal codification he had been working on? This now becomes the single most important instrument of unification. In our history, its impact in the West was delayed and piecemeal. But here, with the West firmly under imperial control, Justinian can decree its implementation across the board. From Antioch to Cordoba, the law is now the same. One empire, one law. This isn't just a matter of standardizing contracts or criminal punishments. The Justinian Code is a profoundly ideological document. It is rooted in the principle of absolute monarchy. The first line of the digest famously states, "What has pleased the prince has the force of law." This is a direct assault on the lingering traditions of Germanic kingship and Roman senatorial privilege. Imagine you are a Roman aristocrat in Rome. Your family has been in the Senate for 500 years. You used to advise Gothic kings. Now you receive a directive from the new Praetorian prefect of Italy, a Greek-speaking eunuch sent from Constantinople. The directive informs you that all legal disputes will now be judged according to the new code, and that your local traditions are secondary. Furthermore, your taxes will no longer be the somewhat negotiable affair they were under the Goths, but will be assessed and collected by an imperial official called a logothete, who answers directly to the emperor. Suddenly, you feel a lot less like a respected partner and a lot more like a subject. This creates the first great tension in the unified empire. The clash between the centralized, autocratic model of the East and the more decentralized, aristocratic traditions of the West. To manage this vast new territory, Justinian has to create a new layer of bureaucracy. He re-establishes the old Praetorian prefectures of Italy and Africa. He creates a new one for Spain. These are huge administrative super-regions, ruled by a prefect who hold immense civil authority. But, and this is classic Roman imperial policy, their military authority is kept separate, held by a magisterium militum, or master of soldiers. This division of civil and military power was a core principle of the late Roman state, designed to prevent any one official from becoming powerful enough to rebel. So now you have this massive bureaucracy. But who are the bureaucrats? In the East, the empire had a long-established, highly educated class of civil servants, drawn from schools and universities in Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria. They speak Greek. They are steeped in the culture of the Eastern court. In the West, you have the old Roman senatorial families and the local provincial elites, who speak Latin and have been running their own affairs for a century. Justinian needs both. He can't replace every single local official from Spain to Italy with a Greek from the capital. so he creates a hybrid system. The top jobs, the prefects, the military commanders, the chief financial officers, are almost all Easterners, men loyal to him personally, men like Narses in Italy, or perhaps a new figure, a Syrian administrator named John in Spain. But beneath them, the day-to-day work of tax collection, judicial administration, and public works is left in the hands of the local Latin-speaking elites. This is a pragmatic solution, but it bakes a permanent cultural and linguistic divide into the very structure of the government. In any major city in the West, Rome, Carthage, Corduba, the halls of power are now bilingual. You hear Latin in the lower courts and the city council, but when you go to the prefect's palace, the language of real power is Greek. Here's a quirky administrative detail that would have a huge impact. The cursus publicus, the old Roman public post system. This network of roads, way stations, and horse relays was the internet of the ancient world. It had fallen into disrepair in the West. Justinian, with his full treasury, pours money into restoring it. Now, a decree issued in Constantinople can reach Rome in 2 weeks, and Cordoba in 4. This communication network is the very thing that allows a single emperor to rule such a vast territory. It stitches the empire together. The sight of imperial couriers galloping down the restored Via Flaminia in Italy or the Via Augusta in Spain become a common and powerful symbol of the restored imperial presence. But this restored empire has 2 hearts, 2 lungs, as Pope John Paul II would one day say of the Church. Constantinople is the undisputed capital of the East, the seat of the emperor, the centre of wealth and military power. But Rome is still Rome. It's the city of the Caesars, the cradle of the Senate, the seat of the most prestigious bishop in Christendom. A key scholarly debate for this alternate timeline would be, how would Justinian have managed the status of Rome? Would he have tried to turn it into a co-capital, pouring money into it to restore its ancient grandeur and spending time there himself? Or would he have intentionally kept it as a prestigious but secondary city to ensure no rival centre of power could emerge? Let's assume Justinian is smart. He knows he needs to honour Rome to legitimise his rule in the West. He initiates a grand building programme there, funded by the state. He doesn't just patch up the odd sewer. He orders the complete restoration of the Forum, the dredging of the Tiber, the rebuilding of the fire-damaged sections of the Colosseum. He commissions new churches, decorated in the latest Constantinopolitan style, right next to the ancient basilicas. He wants to create a city that is both a museum of the old Roman glory and a showcase of the new, vibrant, unified empire. But this two-lunge system is inherently unstable. The Western elites, while enjoying the peace and prosperity the empire brings, begin to resent the authority of the Greeks sent to rule them. The Eastern officials, in turn, often view their Latin colleagues as provincial and slightly backward. The empire is politically united, but culturally it remains 2 distinct worlds, yoked together by the will of one man and the bureaucracy he commands. For now, under the powerful and victorious Justinian, the system holds. But the question that would hang in the air, in the palaces of Ravenna and the villas of Spain, is, what happens when a weaker man sits on the throne in Constantinople? Can this hybrid creation survive its creator? While Justinian and his administrators are busy untangling the complex knot of governing the newly reconquered West, a storm is gathering on the empire's other frontiers. In our history, the endless Gothic War and the devastation of the plague left the eastern and Balkan frontiers critically undermanned. Justinian was forced to buy off his enemies with massive subsidies or fight desperate defensive actions with depleted armies. The Sasanian king, Khosrau I, ran rampant through Syria, sacking Antioch in 540. The Slavs and Bulgars poured across the Danube, reaching the very walls of Constantinople itself. These crises permanently weakened the empire's traditional heartlands. But in our alternate timeline, the situation is profoundly different. It's the early 540s. The wars in the west were short, sharp, and decisive. The plague never happened. This means Justinian has three things he lacked in our world: money, manpower, and a victorious, experienced army. He can now turn his full attention to securing the frontiers that his predecessors had always considered the most important. Let's look at the east first. The eternal peace with Persia has held, partly due to Khosrau's own problems, and partly because Justinian's border garrisons were never stripped bare. But everyone knows Khosrau is just waiting for an opportunity. In our timeline, he found that opportunity when he invaded and sacked Antioch. Here, that invasion never happens. Instead, Justinian decides to take a proactive stance. He doesn't want to conquer Persia. That was always a fool's errand, as emperors like Julian and Crassus had learned the hard way. He wants to establish a stable, defensible frontier. He sends Belisarius, yes, him again, the man is a walking triumph, to the eastern front. But Belisarius' mission is not to seek a massive, decisive battle. It's to fortify. Justinian pours a fortune into strengthening the great fortress cities of the frontier: Dara, Amida, Edessa. It's a historical fact that Justinian was an obsessive builder of fortifications. Archaeologists have found hundreds of his forts across the empire. In this timeline, his building program on the Persian frontier becomes an impenetrable shield. He builds not just walls, but a deep defensive zone with watchtowers, supply depots, and loyal Arab client tribes like the Ghassanids, who are paid handsomely to act as a buffer against the Persians' own Lakhmid allies. When Khosrau eventually does decide to test the Roman defences, instead of finding an easy path to Antioch, he finds a wall of steel. His sieges of the newly reinforced fortresses fail. His raids are harassed by Belisarius' mobile cavalry forces. The war becomes a costly stalemate for the Sasanians. After a few campaigning seasons, Khosrau, a pragmatist at heart, realises that the balance of power has shifted. He agrees to a new, more permanent peace treaty. But this time, Justinian negotiates from a position of overwhelming strength. The border is fixed, trade routes are secured, and maybe Khosrau even agrees to stop persecuting his empire's Christian minority. The Persian threat, which bled the empire white for a century in our history, is effectively neutralised for a generation. This has enormous consequences. The provinces of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt are the economic engine of the Roman Empire. They are the wealthiest, most populous, and most urbanised regions. In our history, they suffered from decades of warfare and instability. Here, they enjoy uninterrupted peace and prosperity. The great cities of Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem continue to thrive as centres of commerce and learning. The tax revenue from these provinces flows, uninterrupted, into the imperial treasury, funding the administration of the west and the defence of the north. And it's to the north, along the Danube, that the second great storm is brewing. For decades, Slavic tribes had been filtering across the river, at first in small raiding parties, then in larger groups, settling in the depopulated lands of the Balkans. In our history, the empire was too weak to stop them. The Balkans were effectively lost, becoming a Slavic heartland and permanently cutting the land route between Constantinople and the Latin West. A quirky but telling detail from this period is the sheer number of coin hoards found buried in the Balkans. People were literally burying their life savings and fleeing, a sure sign of societal collapse. But in our timeline, Justinian can address this threat head on. With the Persian front secure and Italy pacified, he can transfer several veteran legions, perhaps led by the grizzled old eunuch Narses, after his administrative stint in Italy, to the Danube. The strategy here is not just defensive. Justinian launches a series of powerful campaigns north of the river, into what is now Romania and Ukraine. He isn't trying to conquer these vast, forested lands. He's doing what strong Roman emperors had always done, engaging in punitive expeditions to awe the barbarians into submission. The imperial army, with its heavy cavalry and advanced siegecraft, is unlike anything the Slavic tribes have ever faced. Roman legions reoccupy and strengthen the old forts along the river, from Belgrade to the Black Sea. The Danube once again becomes a hard, militarized frontier, not a porous membrane. Some Slavic tribes are driven back. Others are defeated and then offered a deal, settle inside the empire in the underpopulated regions of Thrace and Moesia as federati, farming the land and providing soldiers in exchange for peace and protection. This policy of settling barbarian groups on Roman soil was a double-edged sword that historians continue to debate. It could pacify a frontier and provide recruits, but it also diluted the traditional makeup of the provinces. Here, however, with the empire strong and confident, it works. The Slavic tide is managed, channeled, and absorbed, not allowed to become a flood that sweeps away Roman control. By the year 550, the map of the world looks dramatically different. The Roman Empire is secure on all fronts. Its traditional core in the east is peaceful and prosperous. Its new acquisitions in the west are being integrated into the imperial system. The two great external threats that historically brought the empire to its knees, the Persians and the Slavs, have been checked. The empire is no longer a beleaguered state fighting for survival. It is a confident, unchallenged superpower. This security allows for an unprecedented flourishing of culture and economy, a true golden age. But this newfound unity and strength will soon face its most dangerous test, one that comes not from an external army, but from within, a battle for the very soul of the Christian faith. With the frontiers secure and the administration of the West taking shape, the restored Roman Empire enters a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity. It is the mid-6th century, and for the first time in generations, the entire Mediterranean basin is under the control of a single, stable, and wealthy power. This newfound security unleashes a wave of economic and cultural energy that we can rightly call a new Roman Golden Age, a Justinianic Renaissance. The engine of this boom is trade. With pirates swept from the seas and a uniform currency and legal system in place from Spain to Syria, commerce flourishes. A merchant can now load his ship with Andalusian olive oil, sail to Ostia, trade it for Italian wine, continue to Alexandria to pick up Egyptian grain and Indian spices that have come up the Red Sea, and sell them all in the bustling markets of Constantinople, all within the borders of a single state. This integrated Mediterranean economy is the crucial historical reality that made the old Roman Empire so wealthy. Justinian's restoration brings it back to life. The great port cities, Carthage, Naples, Marseille, Ephesus, which had seen a decline in the previous century, now hum with activity. This flood of trade and tax revenue allows Justinian to indulge in his greatest passion, building. In our history, his projects were magnificent, but ultimately constrained by the ruinous cost of his wars and the plague. In this timeline, with a full treasury, his ambition knows no bounds. His crowning achievement, the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, still stands as a testament to his vision. But now, that vision is exported to the West. As we touched upon, he launches a massive building program in Rome, but it's far grander than simple repairs. He sees a chance to remake Rome in the image of his new Orthodox Christian empire. He orders the construction of a series of magnificent churches, their interiors shimmering with the golden mosaics that were the hallmark of Constantinopolitan art. Imagine a church like San Vitale in Ravenna, with its famous portraits of Justinian and Theodora, but built on an even grander scale right next to the Roman Forum. This isn't just about faith, it's about stamping the city with the visual signature of its new master. He doesn't stop at churches. He funds the restoration of public buildings, baths, libraries, and even the Colosseum, which is perhaps repaired enough to host grand public spectacles again. Not gladiatorial combat, which had been banned, but perhaps chariot races or grand historical pageants celebrating the restoration of the empire. Here's a quirky detail about Roman entertainment. They loved spectacles involving wild animals. Justinian could now stage a grand venatio, a beast hunt, in the restored Colosseum, featuring lions from Africa and bears from the Balkans, a display of the vast reach of his unified domain that would have thrilled the Roman populace. This imperial patronage extends beyond Rome. In Ravenna, which remains the administrative capital of Italy, he funds the completion of its famous churches. In Carthage, he rebuilds the city walls and constructs a new palace for the governor. In Cordoba, the new capital of Roman Spain, he lays the foundations for a great cathedral. This architectural boom isn't just about prestige, it's a massive economic stimulus program. It employs thousands of stonemasons, mosaic artists, carpenters, and labourers, spreading imperial wealth throughout the western provinces and fostering a sense of shared purpose and identity. This cultural flourishing isn't limited to architecture. With peace and stability, scholarship and literature, which have been flickering embers in the West, are rekindled. In our timeline, the leading intellectual of the age in Italy was Cassiodorus, a Roman aristocrat who served the Gothic kings. After the brutal Gothic War, he retreated from public life and founded a monastery, the Vivarium, dedicated to preserving and copying texts, both sacred and classical. It was a desperate act of cultural conservation, an attempt to save knowledge from a world falling apart. In this new timeline, Cassiodorus doesn't need to retreat. Instead, he becomes a key cultural advisor to the new imperial administration in Italy. He doesn't found a secluded monastery. He persuades the government to fund a new imperial library and academy in Rome, a sister institution to the great university in Constantinople. Here, scholars from both the Latin West and the Greek East can come together. Latin scholars are reintroduced to the works of Plato and Aristotle in the original Greek, which had been largely lost to the West. Greek scholars get access to the vast archives of Latin literature and history preserved in Rome. This cross-pollination of ideas is electrifying. Scholars have long debated the extent to which the Greek and Latin intellectual worlds had drifted apart by the 6th century. In our world, the drift became a chasm. In this alternate history, Justinian's unified empire begins to build a bridge across it. We see the beginnings of a true synthesis, a Greco-Roman intellectual revival that blends the philosophical traditions of the East with the legal and historical traditions of the West. This might not be a full-blown Italian Renaissance as we know it. The social and economic conditions are not yet right for that. But it is a powerful Carolingian Renaissance, 2 centuries early, and on a much grander scale. This golden age, however, has a distinct character. It is deeply fundamentally Christian. But it is Justinian's brand of Christianity, imperial, orthodox, and intolerant of dissent. The same decrees that fund the building of cathedrals also order the closing of the last pagan temples. The Academy of Athens, a bastion of pagan Neoplatonism, had already been closed by Justinian in 529. In this stronger, more confident empire, that policy is enforced with renewed vigour. The last vestiges of classical paganism are stamped out. Similarly, heretical Christian groups, like the Arians who had been protected by the Goths, now face a choice: convert to state-approved Chalcedonian orthodoxy or face persecution. So, this Justinianic golden age is a brilliant but sharp-edged thing. It is an age of magnificent art, renewed scholarship, and booming trade. But it is also an age of enforced conformity, both political and religious. The creative energy is channeled into the service of the state and the church. The peace and unity that allow a scholar to travel freely from Gaul to Syria also mean that an imperial decree demanding a new tax or condemning a new heresy can be enforced just as easily. The empire is a magnificent, glittering cage, and soon the question of who holds the key to that cage, the emperor in Constantinople or the pope in Rome, will bring this golden age to a crisis point. The great project of restoration is complete. The empire is united, prosperous and secure. But beneath the shimmering gold mosaics and the hum of renewed commerce, a deep fissure is forming, a crack in the very foundation of Justinian's one empire, one God ideology. This is the struggle for the soul of the church, a theological and political battle that will pit the absolute power of the emperor in Constantinople against the burgeoning authority of the Pope in Rome. To understand this conflict, you have to understand the two very different positions of the Pope and the Patriarch of Constantinople. The Patriarch was the top churchman in the East, but he lived and worked literally in the shadow of the emperor's palace. He was a powerful figure, but ultimately he was the emperor's man. Emperors could, and frequently did, depose patriarchs who displeased them. In the East, the concept of symphonia developed, the idea that the church and the state were two parts of a single organism working in harmony. In practice, the emperor was always the senior partner. He saw himself as God's representative on earth, responsible for the spiritual well-being of his subjects, and he routinely called church councils and issued theological decrees. The Pope in Rome, however, had a very different history. Since the political collapse of the Western Empire, the Pope had often been the most powerful and consistent authority figure in Italy. Popes like Leo the Great in the 5th century had faced down Attila the Hun, organised the city's defences, and acted as de facto rulers. They had grown accustomed to a great deal of political and theological independence. A crucial historical development was the Petrine theory, based on the Gospel of Matthew, which asserted that the Bishop of Rome, as the successor of St. Peter, held a position of primacy over all other bishops. This claim was largely accepted in the West, but was viewed with deep suspicion in the East, where the other ancient patriarchates, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem, saw Rome as being first among equals, not an absolute monarch. For the first few years of the liberation, this tension is manageable. The Pope in Rome is simply relieved to be rid of his Arian Gothic masters. But the reality of his new situation soon sinks in. He is no longer an independent player. He is a subject of the Roman Emperor, and that Emperor, Justinian, is a notorious theological meddler. Justinian was genuinely, obsessively pious. He spent his nights reading scripture and engaging in theological debates with bishops. But his piety was fused with his imperial ambition. He believed that the unity of the empire depended on the unity of the church. The biggest theological problem of his day was monophysitism. This was a belief particularly strong in the vital provinces of Egypt and Syria, that Christ had only one divine nature, not two natures, divine and human, as defined by the Council of Chalcedon in 451. Monophysitism was technically a heresy, but millions of his subjects, including, it was rumoured, the Empress Theodora herself, subscribed to it. Justinian's great goal was to find a theological formula that could reconcile the monophysites with the Chalcedonian Orthodox majority. If he could heal this schism, he would secure the loyalty of his richest provinces. In 544, he issued an edict known as the Three Chapters. This edict condemned the writings of three long-dead theologians who were particularly hated by the monophysites. Justinian hoped this would be a concession, a way to show the monophysites he was listening. He demanded that all the major bishops of the empire, including the Pope, sign his condemnation. This is where the crisis erupts. To the bishops in the West, this looked like a betrayal of the Council of Chalcedon. The three condemned theologians, while controversial, had died in good standing with the Church. Condemning them posthumously seemed to be undermining the authority of a major ecumenical council, all to appease a bunch of heretics in Egypt. Pope Vigilius, the man on the spot, is caught in an impossible position. The clergy of Italy, Spain, and North Africa are adamant he cannot sign, but Justinian is not a man who takes no for an answer. In our timeline, what happened next was a farce and a tragedy. Justinian had Pope Vigilius basically kidnapped from Rome in 545 and brought to Constantinople. For nearly a decade, the Pope was held as a virtual prisoner, bullied, threatened, and pressured into accepting the emperor's position. He waffled, signing the condemnation, then retracting it, then signing it again. His vacillation destroyed his authority in the West, where many bishops simply broke off communion with him, creating a schism that lasted for decades. It was a humiliating spectacle that demonstrated the raw power of the emperor over the papacy. In our new timeline, with the West strong, unified and loyal, the Pope's position is different. Let's call him Pope Leo X, no relation to the Renaissance one. He is a man of principle and courage. When Justinian's edict arrives in Rome, he convenes a synod of all the major Western bishops from Italy, Spain, Gaul, and Africa. They meet in the restored Lateran Palace. This isn't just a local Italian meeting. It's a grand council of the entire Latin Church, and their verdict is unanimous. They reject the emperor's edict. Leo sends a carefully worded but firm letter back to Constantinople. He addresses the emperor with all due respect, but states that the See of Peter cannot and will not condemn the 3 chapters, as it would compromise the faith handed down from the apostles. Justinian is enraged. This is open defiance. In our world, he could snatch the Pope from a chaotic, war-torn Italy, but now Pope Leo is the beloved and respected leader of a peaceful and prosperous West. Arresting him would risk a massive rebellion. This raises a fascinating scholarly debate. Could the papacy have established de jure spiritual supremacy if it had the de facto political backing of a unified West? Justinian tries a different tactic. He summons his own Grand Council in the East, which duly rubber stamps his position. He then declares the Pope to be excommunicated for his disobedience. In response, Pope Leo, backed by his Western Council, excommunicates the Patriarch of Constantinople for heresy. The Church is now in a state of formal schism. It's not the later East-West schism of 1054 over the Filioque Clause, but a new, earlier and more politically charged break. This schism plays out across the empire. In the East, everyone follows the emperor. In the West, everyone follows the Pope. The hybrid bureaucracy is torn apart by divided loyalties. A Greek-speaking governor in Carthage finds that his local Latin bishops will no longer attend official functions. The Frankish king in Gaul, who is staunchly Catholic, sides with the Pope, straining his client relationship with the emperor. A quirky detail of church politics is the power of relics. Imagine a Western bishop refusing to allow a newly arrived Eastern general to venerate the bones of a local saint. A profound public insult. The one empire is now split down the middle by 2 churches. The single body politic has 2 warring heads. Justinian, the great unifier, has inadvertently created the deepest division of all. He has restored the body of the Roman Empire, but he has cleaved its soul in 2. This struggle, born from one man's obsessive desire for unity, ensures that the Latin West and the Greek East, even under the same flag, will continue to develop along separate paths with separate identities. This religious Cold War will define the empire's future, and it will be raging when the next great, unexpected storm breaks upon the world. A storm gathering in the deserts of Arabia. The golden age of Justinian, for all its brilliance, could not last forever. He died in 565, an old man who had reshaped the world through sheer force of will. His successors, men like Justin II, Tiberius II Constantine, and Maurice, were left to manage the vast, complex, and internally divided empire he had forged. They faced their own challenges: palace intrigue, renewed but manageable troubles in the Balkans and the East, and the constant grinding tension of the religious schism between Rome and Constantinople. Yet, the edifice held. The restored empire was simply too big, too rich, and too powerful to fail easily. The peace with Persia, negotiated from a position of strength, largely held. The West remained secure. For more than half a century, the empire Justinian built endured, a colossus bestriding the Mediterranean world. And then, in the early 7th century, from a direction no one was looking, the world changed. Out of the deserts of Arabia, a place the Romans and Persians had always dismissed as a dusty, backward fringe inhabited by squabbling tribes, came a firestorm. A new faith, Islam, and a new political unity forged by the Prophet Muhammad had unleashed the energy of the Arab people in a way history had never seen. Fired by religious zeal and brilliant military leadership, Arab armies erupted from the peninsula, ready to challenge the two ancient empires that had dominated the world for centuries. Now, this is the single most critical historical fact to understand about what happened next in our own timeline. When the Arab armies emerged in the 630s, they found the Roman and Sasanian Persian empires on their knees. These two superpowers had just concluded a 26-year-long war of annihilation, a conflict so brutal and exhausting it has been called a world war of the ancient world. The Persian king Khosrow II had conquered Syria, Egypt, and Anatolia, even reaching the walls of Constantinople. The Roman Emperor Heraclius had then staked everything on a desperate counterattack, brilliantly leading his armies deep into the Persian heartland and ultimately winning the war. But it was the definition of a Pyrrhic victory. Both empires were utterly bankrupted, their armies bled white, their populations ravaged. They were hollow shells, ripe for the taking. This is why the Arab conquest was so stunningly fast in our history. But in the world we have built tonight, that cataclysmic Roman-Persian war never happened. The peace Justinian had forged held, strained at times, but it held. The empire is not exhausted. It is rich. Its armies are at full strength. And it is governed by that same capable emperor, Heraclius. When the Arab armies begin their raids into Roman Palestine and Syria, they are not kicking at a rotten door. They are knocking on a gate of iron. The initial shock is still profound. The Arabs' tactics, swift, camel-mounted raids, mastery of desert warfare, and the sheer ferocity of their belief catch the Roman frontier garrisons by surprise. They win several early skirmishes. Heraclius, a seasoned and brilliant commander, understands this is not just another tribal raiding party. This is an existential threat. He gathers the main imperial field army, the veteran legions of the East, and marches to confront them. The decisive battle takes place in 636, at the same place as in our history, the banks of the Yarmouk River. In our timeline, the Battle of Yarmouk was the single greatest military disaster in Roman history. The imperial army was annihilated, leaving Syria, Palestine, and Egypt defenceless. But here, the Roman army is not a patchwork force of exhausted survivors. It's a large, well-equipped, and confident army, backed by the full resources of a prosperous state. The battle is a horrific, bloody affair that rages for days. The Roman heavy cataphracts struggle on the broken terrain, but their discipline and numbers are immense. Heraclius, instead of directing the battle from distant Antioch, is there in person. He prevents the fatal mistakes that plagued the historical battle, the poor coordination, the infighting among his generals. In the final, desperate clash, the Roman line bends, but it does not break. They hold. They inflict devastating casualties on the Arab forces, and at the end of the week, it is the Arabs, overextended and having lost the element of surprise, who are forced to retreat back into the desert to regroup. Yarmouk is not a total victory, but it is a decisive one. The Arab lightning conquest is stopped dead in its tracks. Syria and the holy city of Jerusalem remain Roman. The ahistoric fall of the Christian Near East is averted. The conflict does not end, of course. Historians would endlessly debate the primary driver of the early Islamic conquests. Was it faith, economic pressure, or a sophisticated political project? Whatever the driver, it was too powerful to be stopped by one defeat. The war evolves into a long grinding struggle for the frontier, a new limes arabicus that stretches from Gaza to the Euphrates. This successful defence of Syria has a critical knock-on effect. In our history, the Arabs, after taking Syria, swung south and invaded Egypt. Egypt, isolated, poorly defended, and with a large Coptic Christian population that was alienated from Constantinople, fell quickly. The loss of Egypt, the empire's breadbasket, was a mortal blow. But in this timeline, the land route to Egypt remains secure. The Roman navy, which is unchallenged in the Mediterranean, can easily reinforce the great port of Alexandria. Here's a detail for you. This is the perfect moment for the empire to deploy its most terrifying secret weapon, Greek fire. Imagine an Arab fleet attempting to blockade Alexandria, only to be met by Roman dromons, spraying a liquid flame that cannot be extinguished by water. The naval assault fails, Egypt is held. And if Egypt is held, the entire course of Western history is changed. The historical Arab conquest of North Africa was launched from Egypt. Without that base, the long march across the Maghreb is impossible. The great city of Carthage, which in our world fell to the Arabs in 698, remains a Roman provincial capital. And if North Africa is not conquered, then there is no staging ground for an invasion of Spain. The dramatic events of 711, when a small Arab Berber force crossed the straits and destroyed the Visigothic kingdom, simply never happen. The ripple effect is staggering. The world of Islam is contained to Arabia, Mesopotamia, and a slowly conquered Persia. The Roman Empire, while engaged in a difficult new frontier war in the east, retains its control over the entire Mediterranean basin. The Latin West, Italy, Spain, Gaul, is completely shielded from the storm. They might hear stories of the fierce Saracens on the Syrian border, but it's a distant problem, an affair of the Greek East. The great historical confrontation that defined the Middle Ages, the clash between a Christian Europe and an Islamic caliphate across the Pyrenees and in the Mediterranean, does not occur. The world we know, a world shaped by the Crusades, the Reconquista, and the cultural exchange between these two civilizations, fails to be born. In the world we've just saved from the Arab conquests, the 8th and 9th centuries unfold in a profoundly different way. In our history, this was the era of the Carolingians. With the Roman Empire a distant memory in the West and the Islamic Caliphate pressing in on all sides, a new power rose from the chaos. The Frankish kingdom. Under the leadership of Charles Martel, Pepin the Short, and finally the towering figure of Charlemagne, the Franks consolidated control over Gaul, conquered parts of Germany and Italy, and fought back the Muslim advance in Spain. The culmination of this rise came on Christmas Day, in the year 800. In Rome, Pope Leo III, who had been brutalised by his local enemies and had fled to Charlemagne for protection, placed a crown on the Frankish king's head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. This event is a pivotal moment in European history. It was a direct challenge to the authority of the emperor, or in this specific case, the Empress Irene, ruling in Constantinople. It formalised the idea that the West was its own distinct political and religious entity, separate from the old Greek Empire. It laid the foundation for what would become the Holy Roman Empire, a central institution of the Middle Ages that would shape the destiny of Germany and Italy for 1,000 years. But in the world we are exploring tonight, none of this happens. There is no power vacuum in the West for the Franks to fill. Italy and most of Spain are not fragmented territories ruled by Lombards or Visigoths. They are provinces of the Roman Empire, governed from Constantinople. The Pope is not a desperate, unprotected figurehead who needs a Frankish strongman to save him. He is the most powerful bishop in a stable, secure Western Roman administration, still locked in his theological cold war with Constantinople, but very much a part of the imperial structure. So what becomes of the Franks? We left them in the 6th century as a client kingdom under their Merovingian kings, nominally subject to Justinian's authority. Over the next 2 centuries, they would likely have continued in a similar role. The Merovingians famously declined into a line of do-nothing kings, with real power being wielded by their chief ministers, the mayors of the palace. This is the dynasty that produced Charles Martel, the hammer who won the Battle of Tours in our history. In this timeline, Charles Martel is still a powerful and ambitious figure, but his circumstances are totally different. There is no Muslim army crossing the Pyrenees for him to fight. The great victory that made his family's name and paved the way for their usurpation of the throne never occurs. He remains a powerful mayor of the palace, perhaps engaging in wars against other Germanic tribes east of the Rhine, like the Saxons or the Bavarians, but he is always operating in the shadow of the true Roman Empire to his south. The idea of him or his son, Pepin, deposing the Merovingian king and declaring themselves the new dynasty would be far more risky. It would be a direct act of rebellion against the emperor in Constantinople, who is the formal sovereign of their king. The emperor would likely respond by funding rival Frankish factions, or sending a punitive expedition from the highly militarized province of Roman Italy. Here's a quirky detail about Frankish politics. It was notoriously fractious. The kingdom was constantly being divided and redivided among a king's sons. The Romans would have been experts at exploiting these divisions to keep the Franks weak and dependent. So, the Carolingian dynasty probably never takes the throne. And without the Carolingians, there is no Charlemagne. The man Karl der Grosse, Charles the Great, might have existed, but he would not have become the unifier of Western Europe. He would have been at best a particularly effective king of a Frankish client state. He would not have been crowned emperor in Rome, because there is already an emperor of the Romans, a legitimate successor to Augustus and Constantine, ruling from the new Rome on the Bosphorus. The very concept of a separate Holy Roman Empire simply fails to materialize. The historical debate over the HRE's identity, was it Roman, German, or something entirely new, becomes moot. There is only one Roman Empire. The political and ideological fracture between East and West that Charlemagne's coronation represented is avoided. Europe does not split into 2 rival imperial traditions. The idea that a German king could be the legitimate successor of the Caesars would seem absurd. This has immense long-term consequences for the political map of Europe. Without Charlemagne's unifying reign, the political consolidation of what we now call France and Germany may not happen in the same way. Charlemagne's empire, though it broke apart after his death, created a shared cultural and political framework that defined the core of medieval Europe. Without it, Europe, as a coherent concept, is slower to emerge. The political landscape might remain a more fragmented patchwork of Germanic kingdoms and tribal confederations north of the Alps. Saxons, Bavarians, Thuringians, Alemanni, all jostling for power, but none able to achieve the hegemony of Charlemagne's Franks. Furthermore, the relationship between the Pope and secular power develops very differently. The historical alliance between the papacy and the Frankish kings was a defining feature of the early Middle Ages. The Pope gave the Carolingians legitimacy. The Carolingians gave the Pope military protection and established the Papal States in central Italy. In our alternate timeline, this alliance never forms. The Pope remains a subject of the Emperor in Constantinople. His political power is circumscribed, even as his spiritual authority in the West is immense due to the ongoing schism. He cannot simply anoint a new emperor in the West to suit his needs. The delicate, centuries-long dance between popes and Holy Roman emperors, which produced conflicts like the investiture controversy and shaped the very idea of separation between church and state, never takes place. Instead of a Europe divided between the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Caliphate, and a nascent Latin Christendom, the world of the 9th century is dominated by a single, colossal Roman Empire. This empire is Christian, but it is a house divided against itself, with its Greek and Latin halves locked in a cold war of ecclesiastical politics. North of its borders, in the forests of Germany and the plains of Gaul, are the barbarians, still a collection of tributary kingdoms and restless tribes, not the heart of a new civilization. The political, religious, and cultural centre of gravity of the Western world has not shifted north to Aachen or Paris. It remains where it has been for 1,000 years, firmly in the basin of the Mediterranean, in the two great cities of Rome and Constantinople. With the Roman Empire a continuous unified entity, its intellectual life doesn't experience the same dramatic rupture that characterized our early Middle Ages. In our history, the collapse of the West led to a profound loss of knowledge and a fragmentation of culture. Learning retreated into isolated monasteries. The ability to read Greek almost vanished in the Latin West, cutting scholars off from the vast majority of classical philosophy, science, and literature. The Carolingian Renaissance under Charlemagne and the later 12th century Renaissance were heroic efforts to recover and piece back together this shattered inheritance. But in the world we're imagining, the inheritance was never shattered. It was simply maintained. The bridge between the Greek-speaking East and the Latin-speaking West, which we saw being built by figures like Cassiodorus in the 6th century, has now been open for centuries. This creates the conditions for a much earlier, more gradual, and arguably more profound intellectual synthesis than the one we experienced. Let's call it the Roman synthesis. Picture the great libraries of this alternate 10th century empire. In Constantinople, the Imperial Library and the Patriarchal Academy continue to be world-leading centres of scholarship, preserving an unbroken tradition of Greek learning stretching back to Athens. But now they have flourishing sister institutions in the West. The Academy, founded in Rome, has become a powerhouse, attracting scholars from all over the Latin-speaking provinces. New universities, funded by imperial patronage and a wealthy church, have sprung up in other major Western cities. A school in Cordoba, known for its medical studies, a law school in Ravenna, famous for its commentary on the Justinian Code, and a school of rhetoric and literature in Carthage. A crucial fact about medieval learning is its reliance on translation. In our world, the rediscovery of Aristotle by the West in the 12th and 13th centuries was a seismic event, but it happened largely through translations from Arabic, as Islamic scholars had preserved and commented on the Greek texts. This intellectual detour through the Islamic world profoundly shaped Western philosophy and science. In our alternate timeline, this detour is unnecessary. A Latin scholar in Rome who wants to study Aristotle doesn't need to wait for a translation from Toledo. He can either learn Greek himself from the many native speakers in the imperial administration, or he can access new, direct Latin translations being produced by bilingual scholars working in the imperial academies. This direct and continuous access to the Greek classics changes the entire trajectory of Western thought. The works of Plato, which were known only through a few dialogues in our early Middle Ages, are fully available. The sophisticated mathematics of Euclid and Archimedes, the advanced medical knowledge of Galen, the detailed astronomical models of Ptolemy. This knowledge doesn't need to be rediscovered. It has remained part of a living intellectual tradition. This has a huge impact on science and technology. The Dark Ages were not uniformly dark, but there was certainly a technological stagnation in many areas in Western Europe. In this unified Roman Empire, innovation continues, driven by the needs of the state and the cross-pollination of ideas. For example, the famous Greek fire is a closely guarded secret of the Constantinopolitan military. But what happens when the principles of chemistry and engineering behind it start to be studied in the Western academies? Perhaps a scholar in Cordoba, combining Greek alchemical theories with Hispano-Roman engineering traditions, develops new industrial applications for siphons or pumps. Maybe the architectural techniques used to build the dome of Hagia Sophia, when studied by Italian architects, lead to new breakthroughs in building construction centuries before Brunelleschi. A quirky detail about Roman technology is their fascination with automata, mechanical devices that imitated living things. Imagine the imperial palace in Constantinople, famous for its roaring golden lions and singing birds, inspiring a school of fine mechanics in Italy to create complex clocks or astronomical models. The cultural impact is just as profound. In our history, the West developed its own distinct artistic and literary traditions in the relative isolation of the early Middle Ages, from Beowulf to the Chanson de Roland, from Romanesque to Gothic architecture. These were born from a fusion of Germanic, Celtic, and residual Roman influences. In our alternate timeline, the overwhelming cultural gravity of the classical Greco-Roman tradition remains dominant. Latin literature doesn't die out, but it evolves in constant dialogue with Greek. A poet in Gaul might be inspired by the epic cycles of Homer, rather than by Germanic heroic lays. The visual arts of the West would look very different. Instead of the stark, powerful forms of Romanesque sculpture, we would likely see a continuation and evolution of the classical style, infused with the rich, symbolic, and rather static aesthetic of Byzantine mosaic art. The result would be a hybrid Greco-Roman style, perhaps the naturalism of Roman portraiture, combined with the golden backgrounds and ethereal quality of Byzantine icons. We might never see the soaring verticality of a Gothic cathedral. Why reach for heaven when you can recreate it on earth with a vast, glittering dome? This leads to a fascinating scholarly debate. Would this cultural continuity have been a good thing? On one hand, it prevents the loss of knowledge and maintains a high level of technical and artistic skill. On the other hand, it might have stifled the development of the unique vernacular cultures that gave medieval Europe its distinctive character. The very things we often celebrate about the Middle Ages, the rise of new languages, new literary forms, a new artistic spirit, were born from a rupture with the classical past. This Roman synthesis, while brilliant, might also be a bit sterile, dominated by a powerful state-sponsored classicism that looks backward as much as it looks forward. The world produced by this synthesis is more sophisticated, more knowledgeable, and more technologically advanced than the Western Europe of our 10th century. But it is also more uniform. An educated man from Seville and an educated man from Ephesus can read many of the same books, debate the same philosophical points in one of two imperial languages, and admire the same style of art. They are citizens of a single, continuous intellectual world. But as we're about to see, this polished, unified culture hides deep-seated tensions that political and intellectual unity cannot erase. So, we have this magnificent, unified empire. A single state stretching from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. A single legal code. A flourishing, integrated economy. A shared high culture based on the classical tradition. It seems, on the surface, to be the triumphant culmination of Justinian's dream. But if you were to travel through this empire around, say, the 11th century, and you listened closely in the marketplaces, the army barracks, and the churches, you would realise that this house, for all its grandeur, is deeply and perhaps irrevocably divided against itself. The political union has not erased the ancient, stubborn differences between the Latin West and the Greek East. The most obvious and pervasive division is language. While the elite may be bilingual, the vast majority of the population is not. For the farmer in the Po Valley, the dock worker in Carthage, or the soldier recruited from Spain, the language of daily life, of prayer, of family, is Latin, or the evolving Romance vernaculars that are beginning to emerge from it. For his counterpart in Anatolia or the Balkans, it is Greek. This isn't just a communication barrier, it's a cultural one. Language shapes how you see the world, the stories you tell, the jokes you find funny. This linguistic divide is reinforced by the empire's own administrative structure. Remember how Justinian's hybrid bureaucracy worked? The top-tier governors, generals, and tax officials in the West are still predominantly Greek speakers sent from Constantinople. After 5 centuries, this is no longer a temporary arrangement. It's a permanent fact of life. And it breeds resentment. To the Latin locals, these officials are perpetual outsiders. They may be competent, they may be fair, but they are not us. They are the Greculi, the little Greeks, a term that would now carry a much sharper edge of sullen contempt. They are the face of a distant imperial power that takes their taxes and tells them how to worship. This is a critical historical reality in any multi-ethnic empire. Resentment against a ruling elite of a different culture is a powerful force for regional identity. In this Roman Empire, a sense of Latin identity or Western identity would begin to coalesce, not in opposition to an external foe like the Muslims, but in opposition to their own government in Constantinople. A Spanish landowner, an Italian merchant, and a Frankish noble might find they have more in common with each other than they do with the Greek-speaking prefect who governs their province. They share a language, a pope, and a growing sense of being the junior partners in an empire that is fundamentally controlled by the East. This feeling is amplified 1,000 times over by the religious schism. The formal break between the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople, which we saw erupt over the 3 chapters controversy, has never healed. It has become a permanent, festering wound, For centuries, the Western Church, under the leadership of the Pope, has followed its own theological and liturgical path. The Eastern Church has followed the path dictated by the Emperor and the Patriarch. They are now, in effect, two different religions occupying the same state. A quirky but profound difference that would have emerged is the issue of clerical celibacy. The Western Church, even in this era, was moving toward mandating that all priests be celibate. The Eastern Church allowed married men to become priests. Imagine a Latin Christian from Rome travelling to Ephesus. He enters a church and sees the priest celebrating the liturgy with his wife and children in the front pew. To him, this would seem scandalous, improper. To the Greek Christian, the Latin obsession with celibacy would seem bizarre and unnatural. These small, tangible differences in religious practice would make the other side feel alien and deeply wrong. The emperor in Constantinople is in an impossible position. He is the emperor of the whole empire, but his spiritual authority is only recognized by half of it. If he tries to force the West to accept his theological positions, he risks a massive unified rebellion led by the Pope. If he tries to appease the Pope, he faces a backlash from his own Greek clergy and populace, who have come to see the Latins as arrogant schismatics. Historians would endlessly debate the Latin question in this alternate Byzantium. What was the best way to manage the wealthy, powerful, but perpetually stubborn Western provinces? This tension could easily spill over into open conflict. Imagine a dispute over the appointment of a bishop in a major Western city like Milan. The emperor nominates a Greek cleric he trusts. The Pope, citing his spiritual authority over the West, nominates a local Latin favourite. The city divides into factions. Riots break out. The imperial garrison has to be called in. These kinds of conflicts, repeated over and over, would slowly erode the foundations of imperial unity. The military, which should be a unifying force, might also become a source of division. While the legions are integrated, units would still likely be recruited regionally. The Spanish legions would be mostly Latin-speaking. The Anatolian legions would be Greek-speaking. A natural rivalry would develop. In a palace coup or a civil war, the chronic disease of the Roman state, which side would these armies take? It's easy to imagine a scenario where a popular Latin-speaking general, hailed as a hero for his victories against the pagan tribes in Germany, finds himself at odds with the Greek-speaking court in Constantinople. If he were to march on the capital, would he be seen by the West as a usurper or as a liberator, their man come to finally put a Latin back on the imperial throne? The empire of Justinian's dream, for all its external strength, is internally hollowed out by this fundamental cultural and religious cleavage. It is a house of two halves, each with its own language, its own right, its own emerging sense of identity. They are bound together by a shared history, a shared economy, and a shared bureaucracy, but they are growing apart in spirit. The longer the union lasts, the more the two sides rub against each other, and the more friction they create. The great question is no longer whether the empire can survive external threats, but whether it can survive itself. Let's let the timeline drift forward, past the High Middle Ages and into the 15th and 16th centuries. In our world, it was the Age of Discovery. A small, scrappy kingdom on the edge of Europe, Portugal, and then its larger neighbour Spain, driven by a combination of religious fervour, economic ambition, and a desperate need for new trade routes to the east, began to push out into the unknown Atlantic. They were looking for a way around the Ottoman and Venetian stranglehold on the spice trade. This outward push led them to stumble upon a whole new world, an event that would re-centre the globe and inaugurate the modern era. But would this same outward explosion happen in the world of our continuous Roman Empire? It seems, on balance, unlikely. The entire geopolitical and economic logic that drove the age of discovery in our timeline is absent here. First, consider the motivation. The primary driver for Portuguese and Spanish exploration was the need to find a sea route to the Indies. Why? Because in the 15th century, the land routes were controlled by hostile powers. First the Mamluks of Egypt, and then, more formidably, the Ottoman Turks, who had conquered Constantinople in 1453. They controlled the flow of spices and other luxury goods, and they could tax it exorbitantly. The quest of Columbus and Vasco da Gama was, at its core, a strategic flanking manoeuvre to bypass this Islamic roadblock. In our alternate reality, there is no roadblock. The Roman Empire controls the entire Eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea routes. A merchant in Cordoba or Lisbon who wants to trade for pepper from India doesn't need to sail around Africa. He can ship his goods to Alexandria, where Roman convoys sail down the Red Sea, a Roman lake, to the trading posts of the Indian Ocean. The spice trade, the most lucrative long-distance commerce in the world, flows directly and securely into the empire's hands. This control over the traditional trade routes is a fundamental historical factor. Without the economic incentive to find a new, fantastically difficult and dangerous route, the motivation for Atlantic exploration is drastically reduced. Why risk sailing off the edge of the world when the old, safe, profitable roads are still open? Second, think about the political context. The age of discovery was fueled by intense competition between rival European states. Portugal got a head start, so Spain had to try a different route. Then the English, the French and the Dutch all jumped in, trying to carve out their own overseas empires and get a piece of the pie. This relentless state versus state rivalry created a high-stakes innovation race, driving improvements in shipbuilding, navigation and cartography. Our Roman Empire has no rivals. It is a hegemonic superpower. It doesn't feel the same competitive pressure. Its strategic concerns are overwhelmingly internal and continental. The emperor in Constantinople is worried about the deep-seated tensions between the Greek East and the Latin West. He's concerned about managing the barbarian tribes on his German frontier. He's focused on court politics and preventing the next civil war. The idea of funding a wildly speculative voyage by some eccentric Genoese sailor across the ocean sea would seem like a frivolous and pointless distraction. The imperial budget is for legions, aqueducts, and churches, not for gambles on the unknown. The cultural mindset would also be different. The historical Renaissance, which fed the Age of Discovery, was characterized by a new kind of humanism, a burgeoning individualism, and a fascination with fame and glory. Men like Columbus were driven by a powerful desire to make a name for themselves. While our Roman Empire has a vibrant intellectual life, it is, as we discussed, more conservative, more traditionalist, more centered on the state. The ethos is one of service to the empire, of maintaining the great tradition, not of radical individualistic adventure. A quirky detail about Columbus's pitch is that he had to shop it around to multiple courts before he found a patron. In a single, centralized imperial system, there's only one court to pitch to. If the emperor's advisors say no, the project is dead. So, does this mean the Americas are never discovered by Europeans? Not necessarily, but the discovery is likely to be delayed and to happen in a very different way. It might not be a deliberate state-sponsored project at all. It might be an accident. Perhaps a fishing fleet from Roman Hispania or Gaul caught in a massive Atlantic storm is blown drastically off course and washes up on the shores of Brazil or Newfoundland. The half-starved survivors might eventually manage to repair their ship and limp home, bringing with them strange plants and incredible stories of a vast, unknown land across the water. The imperial reaction to this news would likely be cautious and slow. Scholars would debate whether the empire would view this new land as an opportunity or a threat. Initially, it would be a cartographical curiosity. The imperial academies would send a few carefully planned expeditions to map the new coastline and document its flora and fauna. They might establish a few small, fortified trading posts to see what resources could be extracted, perhaps timber or salted cod. But a massive campaign of conquest and colonization on the scale of the Spanish conquistadors seems improbable. The empire has no shortage of land. It already controls the most fertile and populous regions of the known world. It has no land-hungry lesser nobility desperate for estates, as Spain did after the Reconquista. And crucially, it has no pressing religious motivation for mass conversion. The struggle for souls is happening inside the empire, between the Pope's followers and the patriarchs. The spiritual energy of the state is focused inward, not outward. The new world in this timeline remains on the periphery of the Roman consciousness for a much longer time. It is a strange appendix to the known world, not its new centre. The great project of the empire remains the empire itself, managing its internal divisions, defending its continental frontiers, and maintaining the vast, complex inheritance of Rome. The recentering of the world around the Atlantic, the rise of a new global economy based on American silver and sugar, and the demographic catastrophe that befell the indigenous peoples of the Americas. All of these defining features of our modern world are either averted or postponed for centuries. The Roman lake remains the centre of the world. As we let our alternate timeline drift closer to the present day, the world it imagines becomes increasingly alien to us. The very foundations of our modern world, the nation-state, the rivalry of great powers, the legacy of colonialism, the split between secular and religious authority, were all forged in the crucible of a fragmented post-Roman Europe. By preventing that fragmentation, we have created a world with a completely different political DNA. Let's imagine what the world might look like around the year 1800. In our history, this was the age of revolutions. The American and French revolutions had shattered the old order of monarchy and aristocracy, unleashing the potent and often violent forces of nationalism, liberalism, and popular sovereignty. Napoleon was about to redraw the map of Europe in the name of a new revolutionary empire. In our alternate timeline, there's been no Napoleon, no Louis XVI, no George Washington. The dominant political entity on the planet is still the Roman Empire. But what kind of empire is it by now? It has survived for over 2,200 years since its founding by Augustus. It is ancient, conservative, and weighed down by tradition. Yet it cannot have remained static. No state can. The greatest challenge it would have faced is the one we've already identified: the internal schism between the Latin West and the Greek East. After more than a millennium, it's highly probable that this division would have led to some form of political separation. Perhaps not a total collapse, but a formal split. Maybe a series of devastating civil wars in the 16th or 17th century ended in a negotiated settlement. An imperial compromise like the Austro-Hungarian Ausgleich of 1867. The result might be a dual monarchy, a Western Roman Empire ruled from Rome, and an Eastern Roman Empire ruled from Constantinople. They would be two separate states, linked by a shared history, a customs union, and the person of the emperor, who would be crowned in both cities. This potential for a peaceful, managed separation is a key scholarly debate for this scenario. Could the bureaucratic inertia and shared identity of Rome have held it together, or was a split inevitable? Let's assume the split happened. By 1800, we have two massive Roman empires dominating the Western Hemisphere. The Western, Latin-speaking one controls Italy, North Africa, Spain, and Gaul. The Eastern, Greek-speaking one holds the Balkans, Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt. This isn't our Europe of dozens of competing nations. It's a bipolar world of two sibling superpowers, one Latin and Catholic, the other Greek and Orthodox. Their relationship would be one of intense rivalry, a cold war of trade, diplomacy, and espionage, but also a grudging recognition of their shared heritage. What about the rest of the world? To the north, in Germany and beyond, there are no powerful unified states like Prussia or Russia. The area would likely be a mosaic of smaller kingdoms and principalities: Saxony, Bavaria, various Frankish and Slavic states, who have spent centuries defining themselves against the colossal Roman powers to their south. They would be the barbarian periphery, a source of mercenaries and resources, constantly playing the two Roman empires off against each other to maintain their independence. England, an island on the fringe, might have developed into a fiercely independent naval and trading power, its identity forged in opposition to the continental Roman bloc. The Industrial Revolution, which in our world began in that scrappy, independent England, would have a different genesis. It might begin in the resource-rich provinces of the Western Roman Empire, the coalfields of northern Gaul, for instance. But its development would be state-managed, not driven by private entrepreneurs. The first steam engines would be used to pump water from imperial mines or to power looms in state-owned textile factories. A quirky detail of Roman engineering was its focus on massive public works over labour-saving devices. This cultural bias might slow down the social impact of industrialisation, with the state preferring to use masses of cheap labour rather than invest heavily in machinery that could cause social unrest. And what of ideas like democracy and nationalism? These forces, so powerful in our 19th century, would have a much harder time taking root. The empire's ideology is universalist and autocratic. It is based on the idea of a single, divinely ordained state for all civilized peoples, ruled by an emperor who is God's regent. The concept of national self-determination, the idea that the French-speaking people of Gaul should have their own state separate from the Spanish-speaking people of Iberia, would be seen as treason, a nonsensical and dangerous rebellion against the universal order of Rome. Revolutions might still happen, but they would look different. They wouldn't be nationalist revolutions aiming to create new countries. They would be Roman civil wars. A charismatic general in Hispania might rise up, not to create a nation of Spain, but to march on Rome and become the new emperor, promising to purge a corrupt court or to better represent the interests of the western provinces. Liberal ideas, demands for a constitution, for a stronger senate, parliament, for limits on the emperor's power, would certainly emerge, especially among the educated urban classes. The 19th century in this world might be racked by a series of liberal wars, where revolutionary movements try to force the ancient imperial structure to modernise and reform. In this world, a continuous Roman Empire acts as a massive conservative anchor, slowing down the pace of political and social change that was so explosive in our own history. The world is more stable, more uniform, but also less dynamic, and perhaps less free. The geopolitics are simpler, dominated by the rivalry of the two Romes. The cultural landscape is less diverse, with the Greco-Roman tradition still holding overwhelming sway. We are left with a world that is recognisably Western in its classical and Christian roots, but which has not experienced the fractures and transformations, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the rise of the nation-state that define modernity for us. It's a world where history did not so much end as just kept going. And so we come to the end of our long journey. We have followed the ghost of a restored Roman Empire from the dreams of Justinian to the dawn of a very different modern age. We've seen it triumph, expand, and flourish. We've watched it grapple with its own internal contradictions, splitting into two great halves, a Latin West and a Greek East, like a cell dividing under the microscope of history. We've seen it stand like a great seawall, holding back the tides of invasion and change that, in our world, washed over Europe and created the world we know. Let's return for a final moment to where we began, to that idea in the mind of an emperor in 6th century Constantinople, the Renovatio Imperii Romanorum, the restoration of the Empire of the Romans. In our alternate history, the dream came true. The military campaigns were swift and successful, the plague was averted, the administration was established. A new golden age dawned. But what was the ultimate price of this success? What was gained and what was lost by mending the fracture of 476? What was gained is obvious. A legacy of unity, stability, and continuity. In this world, the West never truly fell. The immense body of classical knowledge, its science, its philosophy, its law, was never lost, and so it never needed to be reborn in a Renaissance. It simply continued to be studied, evolved, and built upon. The 1,000-year political fragmentation of Europe, with its endless cycle of wars between rival nations, was averted. Perhaps millions of lives that were spent in our history fighting over the borders of France, Germany, and Spain were instead lived out in the relative peace of the Pax Romana. This world might be more orderly, more technologically advanced in some ways, and certainly more conscious of its direct, unbroken lineage back to the age of the Caesars. But what was lost is perhaps more profound. The very things that make our Western civilization so dynamic, so innovative, and so full of creative tension were born from the chaos of Rome's fall. The concept of the nation-state, which has inspired both great art and horrific slaughter, was born from the rubble. The fierce competition between these states fueled a relentless drive for technological, military, and economic advantage that, for better or worse, led to the Industrial Revolution and the global dominance of Europe. The great scholarly debate that hangs over our entire scenario is this: is creative chaos preferable to ordered stagnation? Our modern ideas of liberty, of the rights of the individual, of government by consent of the governed, were not gifts from a benevolent emperor. They were forged in struggle against absolute power. The English fought a civil war to subordinate their king to Parliament. The Americans rebelled against a distant monarch to assert their right to self-government. The French rose up to dismantle an entire aristocratic world in the name of liberté, égalité, fraternité. In the world of our continuous Roman Empire, with its deeply ingrained ideology of autocratic rule and universal order, would these ideas have ever had the space to blossom? Or would they have remained the seditious whispers of a few radical philosophers, easily crushed by the weight of a 2,000-year-old imperial tradition? The restored empire, in its success, acts as a great suppressant. It smothers the sparks that lit the fires of our modernity. By preventing the rise of a rival power in the form of the caliphate, it averts the long, complex, and often fruitful interaction between Christendom and Islam. By preventing the rise of the Holy Roman Empire and the nation-states of Europe, it smooths out the continent's jagged and diverse cultural landscape. By keeping the Pope a subject of the Emperor, it changes the entire relationship between church and state, perhaps preventing the rise of secularism. Here's a final quirky thought to leave you with. What would fashion look like? Would Western men still be wearing some variation of the Roman tunic and trousers? Or would our modern suit and tie, a product of English courtly life, have ever been invented? The echoes of these small differences are endless. The ghost of Justinian's ambition teaches us a powerful lesson about the nature of history. It shows us that every gain comes with a cost, that unity and diversity are in a perpetual struggle, and that the fall of something great is often the necessary precondition for the birth of something new. The dream of a restored, unified Rome is a potent and romantic one. It speaks to a deep human longing for order, for a connection to a glorious past. But perhaps the true, chaotic, and unpredictable course of our own history, with all its tragedies and triumphs, was the more interesting path after all. The ghost of Rome has haunted the Western imagination for 1,500 years. It seems its power, in the end, was greater as a memory, an ideal to be debated and striven for, than it would have been as an enduring, stifling reality. So now, as our journey through this world that never was comes to a gentle close, take a slow, deep breath. Let the details of this other history begin to fade, like the last light of a setting sun on the ancient stones of the Forum. The echoes of marching legions, the debates of Greek and Latin scholars, the silent prayers in the great competing churches of Rome and Constantinople. Let them all soften and recede into the quiet of your room. The story of this restored Roman Empire is, in the end, a reflection on the immense weight of the past, the way an idea can be so powerful that it shapes the destiny of millions, for good and for ill. It reminds us that the world we inhabit was not inevitable. It was built upon a series of chances, of battles won and lost, of plagues that struck and plagues that spared, of choices made by people long since turned to dust. The path we are on is just one of countless trails through the forest of time. As you begin to drift now, think of the silent, unseen threads that connect us to that distant past. The language you speak, the laws of your land, the very shape of your beliefs. So many are ghosts of Rome, echoes of a world that did fall, and in its falling gave birth to our own. Let that thought settle peacefully in your mind. there is a deep comfort in that continuity, a sense that we are all part of a story much longer and more complex than our own lives. A story that is still being written every single day.